If this video found you, there's a good chance life has already taken something from you that you thought you couldn't survive losing. Not just a person, not just a dream, not just a version of your future you had quietly built in your mind. Something deeper, something closer to the bone. Maybe life stripped you of the identity you used to wear so naturally that you didn't even know it was a costume. And when it happened, it didn't feel spiritual, it didn't feel meaningful. It felt like standing in the middle of your own life while every wall around you cracked at the same time. There are moments when pain doesn't arrive politely. It doesn't knock. It doesn't wait until you're ready. It comes in like a storm through an open window, throwing papers everywhere, turning the room upside down, making you wonder how something invisible can create so much damage. Maybe you tried to explain it to people, but the words sounded too small. I'm tired. I'm confused. I'm going through something. None of it came close. How do you explain that your soul feels like it's being taken apart and rebuilt in the dark? How do you tell someone you're not just sad, you're becoming unfamiliar to yourself? Yet somewhere inside that confusion, something ancient was happening. Not ancient as in old and dusty, but ancient as in deeply human. The kind of transformation people have spoken about through myths, sacred texts, desert journeys, caves, night seas, and symbolic deaths. A seed doesn't know it's becoming a tree when it splits open underground. To the seed, it probably feels like destruction. But from a higher view, the breaking is not the failure of the seed. It's the beginning of its real life. And maybe that's why this video found you now. Not because everything is perfect, not because all the pain is gone, but because some part of you has already passed through the breaking, and now you're finally ready to understand what it meant. For a long time, you may have thought life was punishing you. That's understandable. When everything collapses at once, the mind starts searching for a crime. It asks, what did I do wrong? Why did this happen? Why was it taken? Why did they leave? Why did the door close? Why did my own heart turn against the life I worked so hard to build? Pain often feels personal before it feels purposeful. At first, it looks like life is against you. Later, much later, you begin to wonder if something deeper was actually trying to rescue you from a path that was slowly costing you your soul. Because before the collapse, you may have been functioning, maybe even succeeding. People might have looked at you and thought you were fine, responsible, strong, helpful. Maybe you were the one who carried everything, answered every call, smiled through exhaustion, and kept the peace even when your own inner world was falling apart. There's a strange kind of suffering that hides behind competence. You can be praised for surviving in a life that is quietly draining you. You can become so good at being needed that you forget what it feels like to be free. And sometimes, the soul has to interrupt what the personality keeps defending. That interruption can feel brutal. A relationship ends, a career becomes unbearable, a friendship suddenly feels false, a dream loses its taste, a familiar room starts feeling like a place you no longer belong, and the mind, poor thing, tries to fix everything quickly. It wants the old map back, it wants the old feelings, it wants normal. But normal was part of the problem. Normal was the mask fitting too tightly. Normal was saying yes when your body was begging for no. Normal was performing a version of yourself that kept everyone comfortable except you. Here's the quiet truth. The hardest test of your soul wasn't whether you could keep everything together. You already knew how to do that. You had been doing that for years. The real test was whether you would let the false things fall when they could no longer hold the weight of your truth, whether you would stop negotiating with your own exhaustion, whether you would allow the image to crack so the real face underneath could breathe. That's not weakness. That's not failure. That's the beginning of honesty. And honesty, when it first arrives, rarely feels gentle. It feels like losing the life you used to hide inside. After the collapse comes the part nobody wants to talk about, the quiet part, the strange part, the part where you're no longer fighting the outside world because the real battle has moved inward. Suddenly, you start seeing things you avoided for years. Old anger, old grief, old shame, the needs you buried because they were inconvenient. The dreams you called unrealistic because someone once made you feel foolish for wanting them. The tenderness you hardened because softness didn't feel safe. All of it begins rising like dust in a room where the curtains have finally been opened. You may have discovered that some of your kindness wasn't pure kindness. Sometimes it was fear wearing nice clothes, fear of being rejected, fear of disappointing people, fear of being seen as difficult, selfish, ungrateful, too much, not enough. Maybe your patience was partly silence. Maybe your loyalty was partly self-abandonment. Maybe your peacekeeping was a way of making sure nobody looked too closely at what you actually needed. That realization can sting. Not because you're bad. No, because you finally see how many pieces of yourself you traded for belonging. And then there's the grief of realizing how long you lived according to scripts you didn't write. The grief of seeing how much energy went into being acceptable. The grief of remembering the younger version of you who learned, maybe very early, which parts were welcome and which parts needed to be hidden. A child doesn't stop wanting love when love becomes conditional. A child adapts. They become quieter, funnier, stronger, smarter, easier, more useful, more impressive, less emotional, less needy. And years later, the adult wonders why life feels so heavy. Well, carrying a false self is exhausting, even when it looks beautiful from the outside. But here's where something sacred begins. Not pretty, sacred. Because the darkness didn't only show you what was wounded, it also showed you what was buried alive. Your power was there, your voice was there, your creativity, your instinct, your anger that knows when a boundary has been crossed, your desire that knows what life still wants to become through you. The parts you were taught to fear were not all enemies. Some were guardians, some were messengers, some were pieces of your original fire waiting for permission to return. And once you began to understand that, the darkness stopped being only a place of suffering. It became a place of retrieval. At some point, the transformation became deeper than emotion. You didn't just feel different. You didn't know who you were anymore. That's a terrifying place to be. People talk about growth like it's a clean staircase, one step after another, a nice little climb toward a better version of yourself. But real transformation is often more like being dropped in the ocean at night and realizing the shore you came from no longer exists. You reach for old beliefs, old habits, old labels, old distractions, and they don't hold. They feel like wet paper in your hands. Maybe there were days when your name felt strange. Your routines felt mechanical. Conversations felt far away, like you were watching yourself speak from behind glass. You looked at your life and thought, how did I get here? Not in a dramatic way necessarily, more like a quiet shock. The kind that happens when your inner truth has outgrown your outer life, but the outer life hasn't caught up yet. During that time, you may have thought you were losing yourself. In a way, you were. But not the self that was real. You were losing the self that had been assembled from fear, approval, survival, and old promises you made before you knew you had a choice. A potter doesn't hate the clay when he presses it. He's not punishing it by reshaping it. Pressure is part of the form becoming possible. In the same way, life was pressing against the parts of you that could no longer carry your future. It's uncomfortable to say, but some versions of you had to end because they were built for a world you no longer belonged to. The version that begged to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. The version that confused being chosen with being loved. The version that stayed small so others wouldn't feel challenged. The version that kept explaining, proving, apologizing, shrinking. Those versions were not evil. They helped you survive. But survival is not the same as freedom. Eventually, in the silence after all that inner noise, something remained. Not a role, not a performance, not a story polished for other people. Just awareness, just presence, just a quiet center that had been there beneath everything. And maybe you only touched it for a moment at first. A breath, a strange calm after crying, a morning where the pain was still there, but you weren't drowning in it. A walk where the world looked ordinary and holy at the same time. Small moments like that matter. They're like little lamps along the road back to yourself. They show you that even when identity falls apart, something deeper remains untouched. Coming out of that kind of darkness doesn't make you loud about your healing. Usually, it makes you quieter, clearer, less interested in performing peace and more interested in actually protecting it. You start noticing things you used to ignore, a shift in someone's tone, the heaviness in a room, the difference between a real yes and a polite yes. You can feel when words and energy don't match, not because you're paranoid and not because you're trying to judge everyone. You simply stopped lying to yourself, so your ability to detect falsehood became sharper. Relationships begin to change because you begin to change. Some people don't like the version of you that has boundaries. They preferred the version that was easier to access, easier to guilt, easier to shape. And honestly, that part hurts. Nobody talks enough about the grief of becoming healthier. You can love people and still outgrow the pattern that connected you to them. You can wish someone well and still know they no longer get a front row seat in your life. You can forgive and still not return. That's not cold. That's maturity with a pulse. That's love with a spine. Work changes too. Purpose becomes harder to ignore. Maybe you don't suddenly quit everything and move to a mountain, although some people do get dramatic with it. More often, the shift is quieter. You can't tolerate spending your life on things that feel empty. Your body starts telling the truth before your mind can decorate it with excuses. Certain rooms drain you faster. Certain conversations feel like chewing cardboard. Certain goals that once looked impressive now feel strangely hollow. Success without soul starts looking like a very expensive cage. Daily life becomes more intentional, not perfect. Please, not perfect. You still have messy days. You still get triggered. You still forget what you know sometimes. But now there's a difference. You return to yourself faster. You don't abandon your inner world as easily. You understand your energy isn't unlimited, and peace isn't something to casually hand over to every person with an opinion. Solitude becomes medicine. Creativity becomes language. Dreams, intuition, little coincidences, gut feelings. They all start feeling less random, like life is speaking in a softer dialect and you're finally quiet enough to hear it. After a soul test like that, you don't become someone who has all the answers. Actually, you become less interested in pretending you do. What grows instead is something more useful than certainty: wisdom. And wisdom isn't loud. It doesn't rush into the room waving a flag. Wisdom sits beside someone in pain and doesn't panic. Wisdom knows when to speak and when silence is kinder. Wisdom can hold two truths at once. This hurts, and this is changing me. I lost something, and I'm being led somewhere. I'm tired, and I'm still here. Your empathy becomes different. Before, maybe you absorbed everyone. Their moods became your moods. Their chaos became your assignment. Their pain became something you had to fix immediately, as if your worth depended on being useful. But now, when your healing is more integrated, you can care without drowning. You can listen without becoming the rescue boat. You can love someone without climbing into their storm and calling that devotion. There's a steadier kind of compassion now. It doesn't need to save everyone. It knows that sometimes the most healing thing you can offer is your grounded presence. And that presence affects people more than you realize. Not in a flashy way, not like some grand spiritual performance, more like a candle in a dark hallway. A candle doesn't argue with the darkness. It doesn't give a speech about light. It simply burns, and because it burns, the room changes. Your life becomes that kind of quiet evidence. Someone sees you set a boundary and realizes they can stop betraying themselves too. Someone hears you speak calmly about something painful and feels less ashamed of their own story. Someone notices that you no longer chase approval, and something inside them whispers, "Maybe I don't have to either." Of course, the journey doesn't end here. That would be too easy, and life doesn't usually hand out clean endings like movie credits. New layers will come. Old patterns may visit again, sometimes wearing different clothes. Projection, fear, pride, avoidance. They can still knock on the door. The difference is, Now you know the house better. You know which rooms hide old ghosts. You know when your body tightens, when your voice disappears, when your peace starts leaking out through over-explaining. Keep listening, keep working gently, keep returning. Healing isn't a trophy you win once, it's a relationship you keep honoring.